Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on aspects of development, looking at education. Education is one of the primary drivers of development, and over recent decades, education in the developing world has improved. However, the impacts of the global credit crisis in the early part of the 21st century have led to one of the key agencies of development, the World Bank, to declare a learning crisis based upon data collected before the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Bank defined this crisis by measuring the amount of learning poverty, that is, the percent of 10-year-olds who lack proficiency in literacy. The learning poverty rate in 2020, before the COVID pandemic closed down schools and education systems globally, was estimated at 57% of low and middle income nations. This figure is expected to rise, given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on schooling. National figures for the amount of school days lost to the pandemic vary greatly, with most nations having lost at least 140 days of schooling, approximately 6 months of school time, with lower income nations being hit significantly harder, some losing over a year of schooling, based upon a normal 5-day week. This has led to increasing educational inequality between those in higher income nations and those in middle and lower income nations, with many low income nations already struggling to provide universal primary and secondary education. Despite these recent setbacks, there have been improvements in education in the developing world, most notably in sub-Saharan Africa, where the rates of education, measured by children attending secondary education, had increased from 45% in 1971 to 71% in 2015. Furthermore, progress in the provision of universal primary education, outlined by the Millennium Development Goals, had also improved, rising from 83% in 2000 to 91% in 2015, which demonstrates the progress made in terms of educating those in the lowest income nations. Further progress has been made in literacy rates of young adults, with measurements of global literacy rates for those aged 15 to 24 showing a similar increase over a 25-year period. In 1990, this rate was 83%, and it had risen to 91% by 2015. A key factor in this improvement has been the increased availability of female education and a closing of the gap between males and females globally. However, women do face more challenges in accessing education in lower middle income countries than males do, something we'll examine in a later video on gender and development. One of the factors that disrupts education in the developing world is conflict, usually civil wars and political instability. In 1999, 30% of children in areas affected by conflict were out of school, and sadly this has increased by 2012 to 36%, largely due to instability in areas such as Syria and Iraq, as well as ongoing conflicts in Sierra Leone, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Afghanistan. Conflict is just one of many ways in which education is disrupted. Other issues facing education in low and middle income nations include those listed on the screen. Firstly, the costs of education, not only to the state, but in many areas where there is only private provision. Pupils and their families may not be able to afford secondary education. There are also hidden costs, uniforms, transport, books. A second factor to impact on education in low-income nations is the availability of teachers, with many approaches favouring educating the elite first. Those with higher levels of education either move into more lucrative industries or move overseas for financial gain. This leaves education in a recruitment crisis in low-income countries, particularly in rural areas. A third problem faced by education is the impacts of conflict, not only through disruption to the education infrastructure itself, but also through the displacement of pupils who have to move from conflict areas, and the recruitment, particularly of young boys, to militias. Another problem with education is that one of the solutions that is favoured by neoliberals, the privatisation of education. Whilst this is largely centred on profitable urban areas, it leaves rural education neglected. Furthermore, the education that is offered is largely based upon Eurocentric curricula, which reinforces a colonial legacy. For pupils in Western-style education systems in the developing world, this often leaves them with a glorified version of colonialism, one that rejects the traditional values of many pupils. It also has the potential to cause conflict, particularly in the education of girls, with fundamentalist religious groups against the teaching of Western norms and values through education. This has resulted in girls in the developing world being targeted for pursuing education. Most notably, the Nobel Prize-winning Malala Yousafzai, who was targeted by the Taliban, and the kidnapping of over 200 schoolgirls by Boko Haram in Nigeria, who were being educated into Western values. All of these issues prevent education from providing the skills and attitudes necessary for development, according to modernization theorists. Theoretical views of education, perhaps unsurprisingly, differ. While modernization and neoliberal theorists view the role of education as passing on the desired skills for development, dependency theorists are more critical. Modernization theorists such as Husserlitz argue that education plays a key part in the social engineering of developing nations, transmitting Western norms and values of individualism and entrepreneurialism that are required in order to develop economic growth. Modernization theories suggest that education is a key driver for social and economic changes in the developing world, and focus on a top-down approach to education. This involves educating the children of the elite classes in developing nations, often at Western universities or in schools often in a Western curriculum. They propose that once the elite have learned these skills, they will then filter down through the class hierarchy of nations, and this will provide others with the necessary skills to modernize. Modernization theorists also draw on the work of Durkheim, suggesting that education is key to having a well-trained workforce as the division of labour becomes more complex. This is achieved through the teaching of specialist skills and knowledge in the education system. Other modernization theorists draw on the work of Schutz and the development of human capital. That by educating the workforce, this will lead to greater innovation and new ways of thinking and doing things that will transform nations. Although Marxist dependency theorists are more critical of this approach, as often the new ways of thinking are largely shaped by Western ideologies, rather than developing solutions that fit in with the culture of low and middle income nations. Marxist dependency theorists instead look to develop more critical ways of thinking. Freire argues that the Western approach to education fails to take into account the cultural differences between nations and is a form of cultural imperialism. He suggests that education should be about discovery and criticality rather than a top-down imposition of knowledge. McCloskey agrees, suggesting that developing nations need to understand why global inequality exists in the first place, and challenge some of the barriers to development that are enforced upon developing nations by the West. Dependency theorists also question the role of IGOs and aid. They argue that the liberal attitudes to giving aid lead to the imposition of structural adjustment policies where IGOs control a nation's social spending. This leads to education spending being sacrificed in order to repay debt. This creates conditions for private educational companies to offer services. For example, in post-war Iraq, US education companies such as McGraw-Hill were able to capitalize on aid spending and rewarded contracts to produce textbooks for Iraqi children. For dependency theorists, education should be more people-centered and focused on learning skills and knowledge that is localized and useful to aid development, rather than have Western curricula imposed upon them. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on aspects of development, looking at education. Thanks for watching.